All right. Well, Bill, I'd like to say welcome to the Shoalhaven Probus Club. We look forward to your words about Nepal. It's sort of I imagine Nepal is a mystery, not only to me, but to everybody else. It's one of those places that we don't know a great deal about. And you can enlighten us, please. Thanks, mate.
Okay, thank you very much for having me back. I gave you a talk on Nepal in 2010, and then I focused on the work that I'd been involved in WHO with polio, because of the interesting links with Rotary, and in general about life around that polio project. And so when I was asked would I come back and talk again, I thought perhaps let's not go back to the polio story other than in passing. And let me just tell the story of my ongoing connection with Nepal. And in order to do this, I've put together some slides, a lot of photographs that I've taken myself over the really 45 years that I've had a relationship with Nepal. I lived there for 10 years, and the relationship continues. So I want to give us a little bit of a story of and it's really to have a chat with you about my life and Nepal. Just to remind you that Nepal sits between China, what was previously Tibet, and India, and it's a small landlocked, very mountainous country. And I don't want to go into a lot of details about the geography, about the population statistics, because I want to tell the story of how I got involved with Nepal. In 1970 was my first trip. December 1970, I left on my 29th birthday to go and trek in Nepal. This was going to be the first month of what turned out to be a 2-year study of medical education. My initial training was in medicine, now more than 50 years ago. Last year was the 50th anniversary of our graduation. And I worked initially in clinical medicine. However, in the early 1970s, I got involved in teaching, and I got very interested in the educational process that could be used in the training of doctors, nurses, and otherwise. Educational processes that were not being used. So, much to the horror of many of my professors, because they thought they were doing it right, I said I want to go off and study what different approaches there are to medical education in the different parts of the world. And nobody was willing to fund that, so I sold all I had. I scraped up a couple of little scholarships and went off on this great journey. But I had always wanted to go for a trek in Nepal, and so I spent the first 4 weeks doing that. It was the best thing I could have done. It really opened my mind, it opened my heart, it opened everything, actually. My quest was to focus on learning rather than teaching, so that there might be a shift from teaching to learning in the schools of health professionals. And to recognize that learning, when it really takes place, is built upon what people already know, that it's using capacity that they have and potential to build capacity and promoting strengths rather than eradicating faults. And this led to a real career shift for me, which eventually had me working with WHO for 21 years, 10 years of which were in Nepal, 2.5 in Cambodia, and 8 at WHO headquarters in Geneva. Now, these were some of the photographs that I took in 1970 on the trek. That's the Annapurna Range. We went around up to the Annapurna Sanctuary and then up the Kaligandaki River to Jomason. And it was the most extraordinary experience to be walking for 5 or 6 hours a day, camping out, just with a group of 5 other Australians. Now, this career shift had me returning to Australia to work in educational projects in the health area. And because I was working in a program which brought together the different health professions in a project in Adelaide, WHO asked me to go to Nepal as a consultant in 1979 as a consultant to run a workshop for the teachers of a new medical school. And as a result of that, I was recruited to go back to work in medical education. I initially took 1 year's leave without pay from the University of Adelaide, and I guess 3/4 of the way through that year, I wrote to them and said, I believe I'm entitled to a 2nd year's leave without pay. And the answer came back that we think that if you're asking for a 2nd year, at the end of that 2nd year, you'll resign and do more. So we'd be happier if you let go now. So I let go, and that 1 year of leave without pay, WHO paid me. It wasn't that I wasn't being paid. Was turned into 21 years with WHO, and that's the sort of the breakdown of my jobs over that 21 years in WHO. We went off to Nepal at the beginning of 1981 with our 3 small boys, aged 5, 3.5 and 2, and so they all started school at a small British primary school in Kathmandu. And one of the things we thoroughly enjoyed was, as parents, and with my medical background and with my wife's nursing background, they would always ask us to accompany the school treks. And so in the school holidays, the kids would go off trekking for 4 or 5 days into the mountains. Wonderful experience for young kids. We also had the opportunity to take them to some of the game reserves, and not often do you have the pleasure of flying into a little airport called Magali in the southern part of Nepal and be met by elephants from tiger tops that take you to the lodge and from which you view the game. We also had a chance when I had a meeting to attend in India to get the family to join me there and then take a trip up into Ladakh, which was referred to as Little Tibet. It's a part of Tibet that was broken off and became part of India, and it's to the north of the Himalayas, above Kashmir. So that was interesting. My wife got involved very much. That's Leslie. She's a nurse. She got involved with a lot of community projects as well as working as a part-time nurse in one of the travel medicine clinics there. That's me with the 3 boys. The 3 boys exploring somewhere. It was a great positive part of our experience, and it seemed to make up for all the things we didn't have, like no television, no films to go to. We had to boil and filter all our water. We had 2nd day electricity, so we learned to play Scrabble in candlelight. But we did a lot of things together, a lot of reading of books together, and that was a very positive part of that part of my story. This is our young Michael. He's got us sitting for breakfast, but he's turned us into a restaurant and he's going to take orders and serve us and our friends. I also had the chance there to meet a special lady. I don't know whether you recognise her from the back, but Queen Elizabeth made a royal visit to Nepal, and they lined up all the Commonwealth and citizens to meet the Queen and Prince Philip. So that was a fairly big occasion and a very pleasant occasion. She's an amazing woman, she asked me what I was doing, and I talked about working with teachers of health workers, and she said, "Oh, do you work in the same institution as the nurse that I've just met?" And she'd met the nurse 10 minutes before along the line, but she obviously kept those things in her head and made connections, which I thought was quite amazing. It was I think the main part of the work for me at that place was to look at the building of the capacity of the teachers themselves to improve the way they did their teaching. So I didn't do very much other than push them to use their knowledge and their skills to make better plans, to teach better, to train each other in effective teaching and learning within a nursing, health assistant, physiotherapy program. And this became my approach throughout my work, was to say that really my work was to act as a facilitator really to other people's learning. It wasn't to teach them, it wasn't to tell them how to do it, but it was to work with them to find ways of improving the situation for themselves and for the people with whom they worked. And it was very rewarding because it produced results. And when I went back to Nepal, and I'll mention a bit later and show you some photos of later visits, I went back 20 years later, and I visited the institution where we had set up this teacher training, this education support unit. And one of the people I knew saw me and waved to me and says, "Bill, come here, come and look at what we've done." And they had got funds to build their own building, to maintain a teacher training and curriculum development unit within the institute, together with a press for printing their own learning materials. So it was quite rewarding for me to see that seeds sown back in the 1980s had really grown and were now blossoming and bearing fruit into 2005 and so on. Now, the next part of the Nepal story is my work as the WHO representative in Nepal. And that's a rather unique job in WHO. You are the head of the country office. You have a rank as a diplomat so that you go to the meetings that ambassadors go to when they talk about aid and things, but you're also a professional health worker that relates very closely to the Minister of Health and the Ministry of Health. And I had a team of nearly 40 staff who were working on different projects. Things like polio, things like immunization, safe motherhood, diarrheal diseases, malaria control, and a variety of other things that would have an expatriate team leader and then a group of Nepalese and others that would be working with them. So it was an exciting job to be working with this team. And one of the things that happened when I was there, I'll just show you a few slides. Some of you will remember seeing these. These are some of the slides from the previous presentation. Living in Kathmandu is very different than living in Nara. You can hire one of those elephants for your kid's birthday party, and they would paint it up and bring it to your garden and give it kids elephant rides. And so these are just some of the shots around Kathmandu. We tend not to see dogs in the butcher shop sitting under where the chickens are. And you learn to deal with things, take things as they come and deal with them as they are. And and you get used to it. We missed it very much when we moved on. One of the things was the polio story, and my role in that was an interesting one, because both China to the north of Nepal and India to the south of Nepal had started a series of national immunization days for polio. Those would be days in which everyone under 5 would be reached with the drops of polio vaccine throughout the country on 2 days, a month apart. So I went, and the Nepalese were in a very unstable period at this time. There was a new change in government every 6 months, and so I had to go and talk to a change in the Minister of Health every 6 months to brief them on what the obligations were for Nepal belonging to a membership organisation such as WHO, and also what the programs were and what we were achieving with the Nepalese Ministry of Health. And in that discussion, we talked about what some of the options were, and I put it to him that it was time for him to be considering national immunisation days for polio in Nepal. He then said, what would that mean? And I fortunately was briefed enough to say I knew what it would mean. We had staff, we had people in the Ministry of Health who were ready to respond. And he said, right, we'll call a meeting next week to plan the first national immunisation day for polio. So fortunately, I was there then to see the first 2, and then the second 2, and then the third 2. And so these are some of the shots of going out to the villages during the national immunisation days for polio. They would always have a banner up. This was a fantastic program in conjunction with Rotary International. It was a joint project with WHO, and it has been highly successful. I think I didn't check the website to see. I think it's down to 3 countries that are still dealing with polio. But you can imagine my feeling of pleasure when Nepal was declared as polio-free, that I really believed that I had a part to play in that. This is giving the drops. You're all well aware of this. But one of the great pleasures for me was that we had moved from Switzerland back to Nepal, and we left our teenage boys at boarding school in England, and they were out for school holidays when the second of the when all of the national immunisation days were there. And these are some photographs taken on the second occasion. This is my youngest son, Peter. This is my middle son, Michael. And the other boy was somewhere else at the time. So we went out into a far western part of Nepal with them and some of their friends who had come to stay for the Christmas holidays. And it became a family matter. Another aspect of the work, these are a group of girls carrying equipment up into the hills to a school to set up an eye camp. And one of the things that we supported and I got involved in was these wonderful eye camps where a group of specially trained ophthalmic assistants would operate on cataracts and replace them with these interocular lenses. Some of you may have these. I certainly have them. But there was a Tilgunga Eye Centre, which is supported by the Fred Hollows Foundation. And Fred Hollows did all this pioneer work, and I had the pleasure of meeting him and spending some time with him, which is another aspect of the story. They set up the Tilgunga Eye Centre in Kathmandu, and when I was there, and then a few years later, it was producing these lenses at a fraction of the price that it cost to make them in either the US or Australia or in Europe, but at a higher quality and a higher standard than could be achieved in other places. So it was the diligence and the hard work of the Nepalese people that achieved that. So this is a nurse checking one of the older ladies who was virtually sightless, but within 2 days she could see. The other exciting thing, and I remember sharing this with you in my earlier talk, was Martina Hingis, the tennis player, after she won the Australian Open, because she was in the area, and she had donated between $15,000 and $20,000 to a campaign to deal with neonatal tetanus, because very few of the women of childbearing age had been immunized against tetanus. Tetanus was a risk for newborn babies. If you could immunize childbearing women, you could protect the babies from tetanus, which would come from using an unclean razor blade or knife to cut the cord when they were born in the village. And Martina Hingis let us know that she would be interested to see the campaign. So we took her out to show the second part of the immunization campaign. And there's a group of Nepalese women lined up waiting for their immunizations. So these were the sort of things that really were exciting part of my work for me. I never knew what was going to happen the next day. There's something always a surprise, but there were also many of these projects that I got involved in, which made it a wonderful job for me. These are a few more shots of in the town. You don't buy your vegetables at an IGA, you buy them at a marketplace. You often will get the fruit from the fruit seller who's bringing fruit around from house to house, and it's all good, fresh stuff. The bottom picture there with the lady sitting with all her herbs and chilies and things, she sits in the same place, and we were there in 2002, and I think that photograph may come from then. We were then there a few years later. She was sitting in the same place, the same, surrounded, and then we were there in 2012, and she was still there. Not still there, but there again. We also benefited from some of these wonderful shops that sell brassware. So part of my ongoing connection with Nepal is to have some of these sort of things in our house, together with rugs and things that came from our 10 years living in Nepal. Look at the bottom picture there. I don't know whether I should have made that bigger, but there is a man carrying a sofa. That's how your furniture gets delivered if you order a sofa. I remember in our first time there, we ordered beds made out of bamboo for the kids, and along came 3 fellows, loaded each with a bed to the house. And these are some of the older areas in. There's a photograph of myself and my wife with the 3 boys who are now in their late teens, all finishing school and about to go on to university. So we didn't have as much time with them, but we did have a very unique experience in that because they finished their high schooling in the United Kingdom, they finished the school year in June or July, and they all opted to go to university in Australia, so they had until the following March. And each of them, and they were close enough in age that it was 3 consecutive years, each of them spent that 6 months with us as a young adult, doing projects, doing activities, learning the language, and virtually becoming Nepali. And so that was a real privilege for us to have them doing that. I'm sorry, that's another slide of the ICAP, which should have been earlier. And these are the sort of scenes that you drive through when you go from place to place. A lot of our field trips to go and see district hospitals or health centres would have to be done on foot because there are no roads in these mountains. Now, one of the parts of that story that I want to tell you about, and I thought there'd be a few blokes here that might appreciate a car story. at the Festival of Dasai each year, they sacrifice goats as a protection against all moving vehicles. They do it out at the airport. The Royal Nepal aircraft have a goat sacrificed, and the blood is put onto the nose of the plane. People do their cars, the buses get done. And there in the bottom right-hand corner is the Land Rover whose story I want to tell you. That was our Land Rover that was, it has its own story. We picked this up in London and we took it to Geneva via the Channel Tunnel and through France before I moved to Nepal for the second time. And we had bought it because we needed a private vehicle for our own use while we were living in Nepal. So we drove it around Switzerland for 6 weeks or so to make sure we could get its first service while we were still in a I shouldn't say civilized, but in a country that had lots of garages, and there was a Land Rover dealer there. Little did I realise that the British Embassy in Kathmandu had a whole mob of Land Rover trained engineers in their garage because they drove Land Rovers, and so it had very good care for the whole 4 years that we were there. We shipped it to Calcutta. It was shipped to Calcutta, and then I flew down from Kathmandu to Calcutta. My wife flew in from England, where she had been settling the boys back in school, 2 of the boys at least. And we drove it ourselves from Calcutta up to Kathmandu. That was an extraordinary experience. And so these are some photographs of a Land Rover Discovery, which is presently out in the car park, but in rather different circumstances and different situations. Not often do we see it these days surrounded by cattle threshing the rice. But these are some of the shots of this very trusty vehicle, which I have sadly developed an emotional attachment to. And my boys often will say, "Dad, aren't you going to get another vehicle?" And I say, "Not yet. It's only done 450,000 kilometres. It's still going really well." Hardly run. It has a diesel engine, which is great. And the Land Rover people who look after it say, "Don't you dare get rid of it yet." And this was in Darjeeling, a relatively new Land Rover and one of the ancient Land Rovers that you find all over the tea estates in Darjeeling. Now, the last comment that I want to make about my work in WHO was that I saw very much development as capacity building, that it's helping people to make relations they have with others, the government and other countries, to work through. And this seemed to be well worth subscribing to in my work. We learnt a number of things, and a previous slide that I gave to you, and I think it's worth repeating, that we learned living and working in Nepal. These were a number of things that we learnt were valuable lessons. Now, subsequent visits, we had subsequent visits in 2002, 2009, and 2012. And 2012, we went for the 30th anniversary of the founding of the CWAC clinic, which is a travel medicine clinic that my wife helped to set up. It was a Canadian aid group that set it up, but it's now become a recognised travel. So these are some of the photographs I took in subsequent visits. Always a little bit of trekking to be done, and I think there's some interesting things happened on my last trip when I was trekking. I actually developed acute mountain sickness, and that was not fun. And it probably means I won't be able to go to altitude anymore. But subsequently, I've developed other things that stop me trekking, so that's no worry anymore. Now, The other two things I wanted to talk about one was the earthquake. Remember the earthquake? It's nearly a year now since the earthquake. And we had been up in Sydney at a theatre performance of my middle son, who's an actor. He teaches drama, he directs, and so on. And we'd stopped for a coffee at McDonald's at Heathcote, and the television was on. And there were the first pictures of the earthquake. And it was a major earthquake on the 25th of April, magnitude 7.8, and there was a second one on the 12th of May. But there had been, in the year subsequent to that earthquake, there have been 25 tremors greater than 5, 300 or more greater than 4. So it's a recurring thing, and I think that we were quite amazed at the earthquake situation. It was horrifying and devastating to think of the friends and the contacts we had and the people we knew, the Nepalese people who would have had families that were affected, but there was also a sense of relief that this hadn't happened while we were there. We lived expecting an earthquake like that, because they kept on saying it would happen. We had small ones, but not big ones. But it is an interesting thing when you live in an earthquake-prone area. But the sadness and the tragedy faced by the people, it's important to recognise that that earthquake happened on a Saturday morning. So there were no kids in school. Saturday, there were no people in their offices. If it had been a Monday morning, it would have been very much worse in terms of loss of life. These were the casualties by country, because not only did Nepal get affected, but also India, Bangladesh, and China. So there was nearly 9,000 people killed in that earthquake, and nearly 23,500 injured. Now, that's a slide I don't expect you to read, but those are the aftershocks of 5 and higher until July, so 25. And this is what was produced. These are some of the pictures of the... what was amazing was to see how the young people responded. And they all got together and initiated the initial relief efforts. These were the pictures from a friend of ours who had been, who went out and got pictures of what was happening. And this was the school in Rover that got just demolished. And that was near the epicenter of the earthquake. So I looked at the website to say how many since. This was yesterday's data. Nepal has had, it had no earthquakes yesterday, but it had one earthquake in the past 7 days, 3 in the past month, and 323 in the past year. So that's the sort of situation that they're dealing with. And the largest this week was 4.2, and so there you see those figures. So that brings it up to date. Now, the second other story that I want to tell you is about my friend Graham Cluxton. This is Graham Cluxton. He's a Canberra boy, did medicine in Sydney, went and worked as a paediatrician at a mission hospital in Nepal, fell in love with a Nepali nurse, Meena, then went off and studied nutrition, and he came back and joined WHO as the month that I did, to come to Kathmandu as a nutritionist. Then he was transferred to the regional office, and then when I was transferred to the headquarters, he soon came to headquarters. So we were in each other's houses a lot as we moved through WHO. When Graham retired at 63, he didn't come back to Australia like I did. He went and became the director of this leprosy hospital. And it's the Lalgard Leprosy Services Centre, and it's one of the world's busiest leprosy hospitals. And there he is on the left side in his white coat with the staff of that centre. 1,200 new leprosy patients a year, 10,500 consultations, 73,500 outpatient visits. And that's supported by the Leprosy Trust, which is a Christian organisation that works in Nepal, and it gets supported by things like the Leprosy Trust in Australia and other donor situations. Now, there is Graham with his staff. They were also affected by the earthquake. So they tried to provide assistance, and so these are some of his photographs of the people around about where he lived. And this was their vehicle taking blankets out as part of the earthquake victims. And this is a map of Nepal showing the region. You'll see down the bottom the red dot where the Lalgard Leprosy Hospital and Service Centre is, its relationship to Kathmandu, and that's Sindhu Polchok district up towards in the central region. That was one of the worst hit areas of the first earthquake. So there they are delivering blankets. On this mission they took out 800 blankets and distributed. And there's the blanket distribution going on. And there's Graham with his crew. And so it was with enormous pleasure this year that on the Australia Day Honours, he was made an officer of the in the General Division of the Order of Australia. So that's another part of the Nepal connection which I've enjoyed. That's to see a friend and a colleague be honoured in that way for his work. He's quite an amazing man. It's a privilege to know him and have had him and Mina in our home. His commitment is truly amazing, and he's a truly happy man whose Christian faith serves him very well. So I think I will probably just end there with a couple of reflections. I look back on my time and my connection with Nepal as a time in which I learned that I was obviously seeing what others don't see, feeling what others don't feel, not only their disquiet, their discomfort or their pain, but more so the beauty, the joy and the connections as I see the big picture that we're all part of. I seem to be often dealing with others who seem to only see the negatives and the confines of their own small world and fenced backyard. So when I returned to Australia after 21 years living abroad, 10 years of them in Nepal, people seem to have become more greedy and more selfish than when I left. They were more materialistic and they were narrow in their perspective. It may have been that I was just growing old, that I'd obviously grown up in that sense. They were more anxious and more easily spooked by life's dangers and uncertainties. Dangers and uncertainties that we had learned to live within Nepal, Cambodia, and within our own lives and families. There were tears, and there was laughter. There was a fractured skull and a broken arm and things like that in the kids that we tend to not think of as they were things that we learned from experiences that we had. So my message to people in Australia and to a group of Probus people is be grateful for what you have, including the opportunity to contribute through a tax system that works and provides services and infrastructure that underpins our good life. They don't have this in Nepal. Be mindful of how well off we are, how high we are in the world rankings, and how little sense it makes for us to be greedy and selfish at this time. Be active in listening for and understanding the voice of the less fortunate, our neighbours, those within, our Indigenous people, those whose lives have been derailed by mental illness, domestic violence, unemployment, and so on. And I think we can all afford to be generous, to be connected, to be mindful, to be alive. And thank you for allowing me to share my story.